Picture this. It's June 1924. We're inside the Kirling Sanatorium near Vienna. A 40-year-old man, a completely unrecognized tortured genius, is dying of tuberculosis. His throat is in so much absolute agony, he literally can't speak anymore. He can only communicate through these frantic scribbled notes. And right there, in his final days, he leaves behind a terrifying command for his absolute best friend. A command that, if it had actually been followed, would have completely wiped out the landscape of modern literature as we know it. So look, this isn't just some dry, dusty biography. We're diving into an explainer about crippling self-doubt, a massive moral crucible, and the incredibly heavy price of existential genius.
Everything I leave behind me is to be burned unread. Just let those words sink in for a second. This wasn't some fleeting, feverish thought. This was the explicit, agonizingly clear final instruction of Franz Kafka to his best friend, Max Brod. Think about the sheer, suffocating psychological weight of a request like that. Kafka didn't just want his work forgotten. No, he wanted it incinerated, completely erased from existence, unread.
And we're not just dealing with literary myth here. You are looking at Kafka's actual, handwritten deathbed instruction to Max Brod, the literal, fragile physical evidence of an artist trying to commit literary suicide. I want to position you right in Max Brod's shoes for a moment. Imagine standing there holding this fragile piece of paper in one hand and an unlit match in the other. You're standing over a massive pile of unburned literary gold, pages that would eventually become masterpieces like The Trial and The Castle. What would you do?
Part 1. A tormented inner world.
To really understand why he wanted his life's work reduced to ash, you have to realize Kafka lived a completely fractured reality. By day, he worked as the chief legal secretary at the Workmen's Accident Insurance Institute in Prague. So he's basically trapped in this suffocating, endless bureaucratic nightmare of legal claims and paperwork. But by night, he was gripped by this agonizing, undeniable urge to write. He called this state Schriftstellersein, being a writer. He actually referred to literature as a monstrosity. He felt completely possessed by it. To him, writing wasn't some joyful creative outlet, it was a nightly combat, a literal service to the devil. And because it never matched the absolute, impossible perfection he demanded of himself, he genuinely believed his manuscripts were worthless failures.
And this inner torment, it was entirely fueled by his environment. Think of Kronos, the Greek titan who devoured his own children. Kafka actually used this exact myth to describe his own family dynamic, especially his relationship with his overbearing tyrant of a father. Kafka viewed the family unit like a suffocating organism. You were either forced to conform or you were, in his own words, consumed. This toxic environment just absolutely paralyzed him with crippling self-doubt. It alienated him from his own life, convincing him that he was fundamentally broken, and that his art, the only thing that actually mattered to his survival, was flawed beyond redemption.
Part 2. The ultimate moral dilemma.
So let's bring it back to Brod holding that piece of paper. This wasn't an administrative task, it was an impossible justification. Drawing on the brilliant insights of legal scholar Neely Cohen, we can see this impossible choice. On one side, you have the private duty. Does a friend owe absolute loyalty to a dead man's explicit legal and moral demand for autonomy? I mean, if your best friend begs you to destroy their private diaries, isn't publishing them the ultimate betrayal? But then look at the other side, the public duty. Brod absolutely knew Kafka was a genius. He knew he was holding invaluable cultural assets in his hands. So does the cultural salvation of humanity override the desperate privacy of one tormented man?
Now, not everyone thinks Brod made the right call here. The celebrated author Milan Kundera offered a notoriously harsh critique of this choice. Quote, Brod created the model for disobedience to dead friends, a judicial precedent for those who would circumvent an author's last wish. Kundera argued that Brod's disobedience was a massive, fundamental violation of an author's moral rights. You see, Kafka's diaries contain some deeply personal, sometimes graphically masochistic passages. By ignoring the command, Kundera argues that Brod completely stripped Kafka of his privacy, creating this really dangerous precedent where we prioritize our own cultural consumption over a dead man's final, desperate plea for peace.
But there's actually a fascinating psychological defense for what Brod did. Legal and literary scholars have proposed what they call the Odysseus and the Sirens theory. The brilliant idea here is that Kafka was actually double signaling. He knew his own crippling perfectionism was paralyzing him. So the theory goes, he ordered the burning of his books to liberate himself from the terrifying pressure of perfection. The logic being, if it's all going to be burned anyway, well, he could write freely. But, and here is the genius part, he deliberately gave this instruction to Max Brod, the exact one single man on earth he knew without a shadow of a doubt, would flat out refuse to burn them. Just like Odysseus tying himself to the mast to hear the sirens but survive the journey, Kafka tied himself to the promise of destruction, all while secretly trusting his best friend to save his life's work.
Part 3. The Great Betrayal.
Okay, prepare yourself for one of the most eerie, surreal coincidences in all of literary history. It's June 3, 1924. Kafka dies, taking with him his unfulfilled wish that his life's work would burn. The very next night, June 4, 1924, a massive fire mysteriously breaks out in Bad Homburg, Germany. This happened to be the home of another monumental Jewish author, S.Y. Agnon, and this fire absolutely incinerated Agnon's entire library of 4,000 books, along with his newly completed 700-page manuscript.
The devastating, Kafkaesque irony here is hard to shake. Agnon's absolute heart-wrenching nightmare was exactly Kafka's unfulfilled dream. It's almost as if, when the flames were denied their due in Prague by Max Brod, they literally jumped across the continent to Bad Homburg to sate their appetite on Agnon's study. I mean, it is a coincidence so profoundly dark and surreal, you'd honestly think Kafka wrote it himself.
And honestly, the fact that Kafka's papers survived at all post-betrayal is a complete miracle in its own right. Let's map this out. Brod defies Kafka in 1924. Then, flash forward to 1939. On literally the very last train out of Prague before the Nazi invasion, Brod flees to Tel Aviv, carrying these absolute masterpieces in a single suitcase. Then, in 1956, right during the Suez Crisis, they're quietly moved to a Swiss bank vault for safekeeping. Finally, in 1961, an Oxford academic named Malcolm Pasley drives them from Zurich all the way to England in the back of a tiny little Fiat. We came terrifyingly close to losing these works over decades of geopolitical turmoil, war, and crisis, over and over again.
Part 4. Birthing Existential Literature.
So what did all this running, hiding, and disobeying actually save? Well, this single, massive act of disobedience essentially birthed 20th century existential literature. What we're looking at is brilliantly preserved literary gold, the opening page of Kafka's third and final novel, The Castle. It's held securely today in the Bodleian Libraries at Oxford, and if you look closely at the handwritten script here, you can literally see Kafka physically crossing out words. He originally started writing the book in the first person using the word ich or I, and then he went back and meticulously changed the protagonist's pronouns to the totally impersonal, alienated third-person initial, K. This manuscript isn't just an old piece of paper. It is the physical artifact of Kafka literally inventing the modern anti-hero, capturing the agonizing alienation of the 20th century in real time.
But as we wrap this up, we absolutely have to acknowledge the ultimate dramatic irony of all of this. Kafka's most famous works, like The Trial and The Castle, specifically warned us about terrifying, inescapable bureaucracies and courts where you don't even know what you're being accused of. Yet, his own legacy was only saved because a friend defied the rules. And what happened next? For decades, his manuscripts became the subject of literal grueling court battles in Israel over who actually owned them, Kafka's heirs, Brod's secretary, or the state. The man who warned us all about the suffocating nature of red tape had his very soul tied up in it for a century, with his papers locked away in the dark vaults of banks and national archives.
Because of Brod, we get to read The Trial. We get to understand exactly what the word Kafkaesque means. We get to experience the absolute genius of a man who articulated our deepest existential dreads. But make no mistake, it was entirely paid for with a betrayal. So I want to leave you to wrestle with this. Does the preservation of our greatest cultural assets justify the ultimate betrayal of a dying friend? Next time you crack open a Kafka novel, ask yourself, are you holding a masterpiece or the stolen privacy of a tormented man?